Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by George Rexstrew to talk all about the wonderful Netflix series Dead Boy Detectives. And in starting off, I'm so fascinated in how you approached kind of who this character is in playing Edwin, because in essence, he passed away when he was a 16-year-old boy, and at the same time, his soul has existed for 123 years. And so there's a lot of experiences that he's had over the decades, and then there's so many things that he's also never had the opportunity to experience. And so what was your starting point for figuring out how to tackle all of that?
I would say my starting point was the comic books.
Yeah.
As soon as I got the role, DC Comics very kindly sent over the entire library of Dead Boys comics. And that, I mean, that spans from 1991, from their first appearance in the Sandman, all the way to 2014, 2015. So I took a deep dive into those and gleaned as much as I could about Edwin from them. And I think what was great about I didn't have much experience with comics before now. And what was so great about reading them is with the panels, it really gives you this visual idea of what your character could be. So I kind of gleaned how Edwin moved, for example, from the comic books and how he was poised and how, he had a sense of etiquette when it came to being a detective. So that was my starting point, and I think it was such a luxury for me as an actor to have that source material as well as the scripts. That came second. We started with the pilot, and honestly, some of it was just walking around my hotel room. Um, Other parts were working with Jaden, who plays Charles. We would walk around Vancouver before we started shooting, just together, pretending we were ghosts. Um, so yeah, it was a little bit of everything. At one point, I took a couple of ballet classes at Pineapple Dance Studios. So I wanted to leave no stone unturned. So
I love that, and even what you were talking about with the history of these characters with the comic books, at the same time as them being something that people are really connected to, you also, by the sounds of it, were given a lot of freedom and leeway in interpreting Edwin how you felt was right for the series based off of the scripts and your interpretation. And so what was the gift that that gave you of, yes, there is all this history, but also make it your own?
absolutely, I think the thing about Edwin is, even though he's a deeply complex character, he has had quite a simple existence up until the point of the show. There are two fundamental things about him. He's a detective, and Charles Rowland is his best friend. And that kind of gives me a fair amount of freedom as an actor to play around. I would say what was great about having had some of Edwin's backstory already was he obviously came from the Victorian turned Edwardian period. So it was clear that he was repressed. It was clear that when it came to how he dresses and how he stands and how he talks, um, it was clear that I definitely wanted to harken back to those times as well.
Was there specific research that you found yourself kind of digging into from that time period? Because like you said, it's even down to the speech is very different, and there's much more of a formality to the language and the scripts that you have than Charles does as a character, for example.
Right. I actually again kind of went back to the comics first and foremost. So I made a little list of all of the, let's say, old-fashioned expressions that Edwin would use. So, from the comics, I learned that Edwin swears by going blinking flip. So I tried to get those in, but they didn't make the cut, sadly. Um, Hopefully that might be a season two thing. We'll see. Um, but I didn't actually take too much of a deep dive into the Victorian period itself, in terms of specifics. But there were always conversations. So, for example, in my first hair meeting, our first head of hair for the pilot was Anne Carroll, who's amazing. And she just pulled out this giant book of Victorian hairstyles and she was like, right, let's pick one. So there was a real sense of collaboration throughout. And, the same goes for our costume. Kelly Dunsmore was our costume designer, and I had just done a play at Edinburgh Fringe before I filmed the pilot. And for that, I was buying my cast their costumes out from Primark. So when I flew to do the pilot, I really thought I would be in this 2x4 room with a tripod. And because my first day in the studio was a fitting, and then I go into this incredible office. It's so ornate. It's full of mood boards and inspiration pictures, and there's a little candle and a Dead Boy Detectives comic book. Um, and I saw on the mood boards how much Victorian garments there were. And we had a lot of conversations about that as well. You know, the importance of the Eton collar and the short pants. And they did have me, for example, try on trousers. At one point, they had me try on a cape instead of a coat. Um, I would say some of those decisions were just made for me, which is sometimes easier. But they were very, very collaborative. It was a very collaborative process across all departments.
Did you find that kind of once you put all those costume elements on, because I'm imagining that even just the fabrics are like a little bit stiffer and kind of like less forgiving and probably not great when you're under a lot of hot studio lights either, that there's kind of an element of the movement that just finds itself from the fabrics that you're wearing as Edwin?
Yeah, totally. Um, because it's the idea was that I was wearing his school uniform. So that is already a gift in and of itself. But you know, wearing the black boots, for example, gave me a real sense of weight. And I put them on and it became clear of how I wanted to stand, for example. And there were conversations about, you know, for example, dyeing my hair blonde, because in the comic books, Edwin is blonde. In previous iterations of Dead Boy Detectives, Edwin has been blonde. But having had that fitting on my first day in the studio during the prep week for the pilot, I put the costume on and I thought, I know, I feel he's here. We don't need to, we don't need to, manipulate the appearance anymore.
And going back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of you and Jaden just kind of spending time before filming, walking around and pretending to be ghosts in day-to-day life, I was really, really interested in what were some of the ways in which the two of you did that, just to get a sense for your characters.
Um, so Jaden and I first met at Heathrow Airport, the day before we flew out to film the pilot. And the reason why our walks around downtown Vancouver started is we both woke up around 5 a.m. the first morning, jet lagged, and we texted each other saying, should we go find Starbucks? Um, and I remember we took our first walk and it was essentially a ghost town because I think it was a weekend, nobody was there. And we had this moment of, huh, this is what the next few months is gonna be like. And it kind of went from there. I mean, we would, you know, in the early stages, we'd walk around town. We would run lines with each other in our rooms. We'd make sure that we would mind the script and talk through as much backstory as we could before shooting, so that when it came to shooting, we could kind of let go of everything and just be as present as we could. But for example, there are a lot of you'll have noticed there are a lot of references throughout the show to previous cases. Like I think at one point Charles goes, "This is like the case of the drowned diver, wasn't it, Edwin?" And we'd make sure we'd always have a backstory. I couldn't remember now, I couldn't tell you now, but we wanted to fill in the gaps, imaginative gaps, as much as possible, because if there's one thing this show requires, it's an imagination.
And in playing Edwin as well, you know, he's a character that, like you said, he's very rooted in his time period. And so he's not as giving with emotion in terms of words or even just physicality. You know, we see that he's very uncomfortable with the idea of giving someone a hug. He'd much rather give a handshake. And so what were some of the unique aspects that came with playing a character that's not very giving with their emotions, but still kind of finding the way in which he still expresses those feelings? Because we still understand, you know, his feelings towards Charles, the way that he respects him and the way that he kind of gradually lets other people in.
I think with Edwin, what's really interesting is it would be too easy to describe this as just a sexual awakening for him, or even an awakening of sexuality. I think what's really interesting about Edwin and Charles's dynamic, for example, is for Edwin, it's really a discovery of how to love. It's a real learning of how to love and how much he wants to be loved. There's a real sense of inner child behind it all. And I think from a lot of film and TV I've seen in terms of their depiction of male love, it's often sexualized quite quickly. Um, so I knew that there was a lot of complexity to dive into when it came to Edwin's emotion. I'm glad you brought up touch though, because one thing that I discussed with Jaden about touch is there was this interesting kind of dual existence of there's the ritualistic touch that I think a lot of teenage boys have and best friends have
Yeah.
in the handshakes and all of that. And then we have intimate touch, which is the touch that Edwin's not comfortable with. So, and I think what's interesting about playing a teenage boy with his best teenage boy friend is, mimicry is the love language of teenagers. And it was really, really fun to be comfortable with one form of touch and find another absolutely agonizing. I remember a couple of times our showrunner would come onto set and say to other actors, don't touch Edwin, don't touch it. He kind of established it as a rule. Definitely not me, though. I promise you, I wasn't being a diva. I did not enforce that rule, just to make it clear. And actually, do you know what? We There are a couple of times an actor did touch me or Jaden. They would just brush by our shoulder as they walk past, and that obviously wouldn't make the cut because we are ghosts.
I love that. And even in terms of the journey that he goes on, it also feels like there's a journey of forgiveness that he's experiencing as well. And so the scene where he ends up back in hell and he basically meets the person who was responsible for his death and responsible for a ritual that led to him mistakenly being sent to hell in the first place. I thought those scenes were played so beautifully in terms of Edwin's learned so much about himself, and that's why he's able to be in a space of forgiveness and understanding and empathy. And so, how did you want to make sure that you were building this arc into him leading up to that moment in the show so that he's ready for those conversations and to feel very empathetic?
Great question. Well, I would say first and foremost, when it comes to the art with Simon, the boy he meets again in episode 7, I think you're right. I think it's an absolutely crucial moment for Edwin because it's the moment where he realizes that Simon was like him, that he was like Simon. It's the moment he realizes that you can't live a life with regret. He learns about the importance of communication, and that perhaps when it comes to emotional intelligence, he has a fair way to go. In terms of how I built that art in across the series, I think that's where a lot of the other characters help because we have Edwin and Charles at the start who have this very established routine over the course of 30 years. And then Crystal Palace comes in, which, by the way, was a name that was completely lost on all the Canadians. Um, it's a great drag name as well, Crystal Palace. Um, she comes in and completely ruptures the dynamic. She's an immediate threat to Edwin's work as a detective because she comes in knowing about the internet, and she's a threat to his relationship with Charles because he has a crush. So that then forces Edwin to confront past traumas and things that he may have swept under the rug. And then, we have Nico who comes in episode 2, and I think of Nico as the architect of love in the show. I think she has the perfect, gentle nature. She's very sensitive. She has this very tender way of communicating emotions to Edwin and love and kissing. So I think that's a really nice introduction for him. And then we have the Cat King who unlocks Edwin's perhaps physical urges. We have Monty the Crow who Edwin learns to flirt with. And I feel like one interaction leads to another, to another, to another. And eventually we find ourselves on the steps in episode 7 with Charles, where Edwin has this moment of, I'm in love with you. And what's so special to me about that moment is, it's as a profession of love, it doesn't feel similar to a lot of others. This feels very childlike. this is a boy who, like you said, has existed for 123 years. He's read every book there is, and he's talking about love as if it's this new concept. Because I always imagined Edwin had little, physical interaction with his parents. I always imagined he was never told, I love you by his mum or dad. I can't imagine he was ever hugged. And there's this moment on the steps. It feels like it's two children almost speaking to each other and trying to muddle through it together.
I also think there's something really powerfully heartbreaking about the fact that when Edwin, tells Charles about his feelings, that he has the maturity to say, I don't need you to feel the same way. I just needed to be able to tell you this. And it says so much about the fact that he just wants to have this level of honesty with his friend and to not have to shield who he is in front of him. And so what did that line and that part of his feelings really tell you about that interaction and kind of the intention behind him expressing his feelings?
I think it's maybe a confrontation of the reality that Edwin knows Charles doesn't fully reciprocate his feelings. And I think it's also a defense mechanism. I think Edwin's greatest fear is losing his best friend. And by adding in that caveat of you don't need to feel the same way, it just minimizes the risk of losing Charles. We're all averse to change. And this is already going to leave a big grenade in their relationship to a certain extent. Or it's a real turning point, I think, for them because they're finally communicating with honesty when it comes to their feelings. But that little caveat of you don't have to feel the same way, it just again, there's a real innocence and desperation and also lack of awareness of what he's talking about because love is this new concept to him. So I think it's kind of an acknowledgement of, listen, I'm muddling my way through it, so I don't really know how to fully articulate this yet.
Did you spend a lot of time looking at the scripts and really just thinking, based on his experience both in the human world and both in hell, and then coming back to Earth as a ghost, what would his understanding of any situation throughout the series look like? Because even just the mention of, Crystal knows how to use the internet, and that's something that's very different to the way that he lives in books, or, feeling expressions of love for the first time, so there's all these different intricacies and elements that rely on what is his previous experience and understanding of anything, whether it's, something tangible around him in the world or something emotional.
Absolutely. What's great about Edwin is, well, what's very fun to play about Edwin is he's incredibly stubborn. He's set in his ways, and he runs the engine room of the agency for sure. I always thought of Edwin as someone who's very methodical. He loves to evaluate. He formulates the plans, and then he hands the weapon to Charles, who throws it. And the thing is, that system has worked for them for over 30 years. But when it comes to conversations around comfort zone, neither of them are really expanding that because they are fundamentally hiding. They're running away from death. So there is an element to their existence that has been sheltered. And then, like you say, Crystal comes in with all these new ideas, and suddenly we see Edwin in this position where he's forced to adjust to the year 2023. And it's really fun to play because he's discovering it in real time. So a particular highlight for me was episode 5, which was set in the high school, because it was the first time I was able to play Edwin opposite actors and characters who were teenagers in 2023 in America. And that contrast was a lot of fun to play for sure.
Was there also kind of an interesting aspect to the detail of you're not necessarily fully interacting with everybody who's in a scene in the same way because there's multiple characters who can't see the two of them, and so you have to kind of like consciously remind yourself, okay, we're not necessarily going to be making eye contact and there's not going to be any connectivity in the scene, but we're still existing over here and that character can see us and interact.
I think our script supervisor, who was in charge of continuity, was tearing her hair out at times, for sure. That honestly, a lot of that stuff actually took care of itself with the script and the director, and that really fell under their remit. Um, I would say most of the characters I filmed with, apart from Jenny the Butcher, shout out to Jenny the Butcher, were able to see me. So thankfully that wasn't something we had to worry about too much. But I will say we did have a list of ghost rules. So our writers' room established about 20 or so ghost rules. In the comic books, there are 7 clear-cut rules about being a ghost. So we did have to keep those in mind.
Yeah.
I remember, for example, during episode 2, we were filming in the woods, and there was a scene where our director wanted us to kind of clamber over a tree trunk. It was a walk and talk with me and Jaden. And we rehearsed it, and I said, wouldn't we just walk through the tree? And everyone kind of went, oh, yeah. Because obviously with VFX, we have a budget that we do have to stick to, and we can't just tack things on willy-nilly or last minute. And there was another instance during episode 3 in the haunted house where we were rehearsing and they said to me and Jaden, right, now you open the door and walk through. And I'd say, well, we'd walk straight through the door. We wouldn't need to open it. So we did have to be really vigilant in terms of that, because once it's in the can, it's in the can.
So the budget went up a little bit, probably based on you noticing these things.
Probably.
One of the other things that's so interesting when you look at playing Edwin as well is most of the things that we fear in life are things that are built up in our imagination. But Edwin has gone through the experience where he has lived his fear. You know, his fear is going back to hell because he's been there for decades previously and he knows exactly what that looks like, exactly what it feels like. And so, how do you think that impacted a lot of the way that he exists in the world in trying to kind of evade it and escape that ever happening again because he's experienced it?
I think when it comes to the fear of being in hell, I think that is part of the total repression that he experiences. And that's why his feelings are so far underground, because that's a lot of trauma. And in episode 7, you catch a glimpse into what his existence was like for over 70 years. It's a miracle that he came back from that, really. But I would also add that his experience in hell was so gruesome and graphic that it has given him a sense of nonchalance when it comes to violence. So when we would film certain episodes that were perhaps more adult, more gory, more horror centered, we were often given the direction, and now you all gasp. And I would say, I don't think Edwin necessarily would, because he's had his limbs ripped out for 70 years. He's no stranger to blood. He's no stranger to horror. So that was always an interesting thing to play, because Edwin's backstory is so intensely complex. And when we spoke earlier about doing research, that 70-year gap in hell is so massive. There was a lot for me to try and fill in, really.
Yeah. And I mean, overall as well, in essence, you're playing this character with all of these huge elements at play. Like you said, his understanding of hell and what it's like to have limbs ripped off. And then at the same time, it really is this beautiful internal journey that he's going on throughout the series. And, I love when he is in hell talking to Simon and he kind of has that realization, if you punish yourself, then hell is everywhere around you. And so he kind of goes through this internal arc of really learning to accept himself and love himself, and not even just in terms of his sexuality, but so fully as a person. And so what was the experience of playing a character on this very intimate journey, but in amongst such a heightened fantasy world?
I think my job as an actor is always to try and play the truth of the scene. And in terms of the journey, Edwin's journey across this series, I really tried my hardest to just go scene by scene, episode by episode, and trust that the depiction of it would take care of itself, because this is my first experience doing TV, and you really are one cog in a giant wheel. We've got the directors, we've got all the departments, we've got the editors, and it goes through several different stages. So in and amongst the craziness of floating squids and talking cats and sexy witches, I really did my very best to focus on playing the truth of the scene. What do I want from the other characters? Where are the moments of change? And kind of let the imagination do the rest.
I really, really love that. And especially just all of the tiny details that you've kind of interlaced into playing him. And it's such a wonderful series. So congratulations on everything. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Mara.